The transport shuttle hummed softly as it descended through the thick atmosphere of Eloria, the faint blue hue of the planet's sky deepening with each passing second. Ethan sat by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the alien landscape below. Vast stretches of shimmering forests, filled with towering trees and crystalline rivers, sprawled beneath the ship. He felt a mix of awe and anxiety settle in the pit of his stomach. This was his new home, at least for the next year. Eloria, the planet where the very air seemed to vibrate with emotions, the home of a species who could sense the innermost feelings of those around them. He adjusted his jacket, the crispness of Earth's military-style fabric an odd contrast to the flowing robes and natural fabrics he saw the Elorians wearing as they moved gracefully around the port below. In a few minutes the shuttle would land, and Ethan would begin his part in the intergalactic exchange program, a chance for Earthlings and Elorians to learn from each other, to bridge the immense gaps in their cultures. But Ethan wasn't thinking about cultural exchange or diplomacy right now. His mind was racing with thoughts about his new roommate, a female Elorian named Lyra. The Elorians were renowned for their perception of emotional energy. They could feel the flow of emotions in others as clearly as humans could sense warmth or cold. To them, emotional honesty was not a choice, it was an instinct. Ethan had spent months preparing for this, learning everything he could about their customs and ways of life, but no amount of preparation could truly ready him for living among them, especially not with someone who could potentially read his every mood. A subtle jolt brought him back to reality as the shuttle touched down. The doors hissed open, and Ethan gathered his things, stepping out into the warm, fragrant air of the Elorian capital city, Valoran. The smell was different, sweet but earthy, with a sharpness that reminded him of a forest after the rain. He shouldered his bag and followed the guide waiting for him. As they walked through the city, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the way it blended with nature. The buildings, all smooth curves and glass-like surfaces, seemed to grow out of the earth itself, their structures entwined with the roots of giant trees. Elorians moved gracefully along the streets, their long limbs and ethereal blue skin giving them an almost dreamlike appearance. Every now and then he caught a glance from one of them, their large, dark eyes seeming to linger on him for a moment longer than he was comfortable with. "They can feel your nervousness," the guide said with a knowing smile, as if reading his thoughts. "They're curious, that's all." Ethan managed a tight smile in return, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. He'd always been a private person, even on Earth, and the idea of living among beings who could sense his emotions unsettled him more than he cared to admit. What if they could feel his fear, his doubts? Would he be able to hide anything at all? They arrived at a sleek, rounded structure set within a grove of trees. "This is where you'll be staying," the guide said, gesturing to the building. "Your roommate Lyra is inside. She's been expecting you." Ethan took a deep breath as he stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly warm, with soft lighting and smooth, organic walls that seemed to flow like water. His eyes were immediately drawn to the figure standing at the far end of the room, Lyra. She was taller than he expected, even for an Elorian, with long, lithe limbs and skin that glowed a soft shade of blue under the lights. Her silver hair, braided intricately down her back, shimmered as she turned to greet him. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, large, almond-shaped, and the color of the night sky. They seemed to see right through him. For a moment, Ethan forgot to speak. "Welcome, Ethan," Lyra said softly, her voice melodic and soothing. She smiled, though there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps in her gaze. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." Ethan cleared his throat, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. No, it was fine. The planet is beautiful." Her smile widened slightly. "I'm glad you think so. You'll find that Eloria has much to offer, not just in its landscapes, but in its people." She gestured to the small table near the window, where a set of sleek, minimalist furniture was arranged. "Please make yourself comfortable." As Ethan sat down, he felt a strange sensation wash over him, as if the air in the room was subtly shifting. Lyra's eyes flickered, and she tilted her head slightly. "You're anxious," she said gently, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Ethan blinked, momentarily startled. Yeah, a little. There was no point in denying it." Lyra nodded, her gaze softening. "It's understandable. Our worlds are very different. But I think you'll find we're not so different when it comes to what matters." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Despite his initial tension, something about Lyra's presence put him at ease. It was as if she could soothe the sharp edges of his nerves just by being near. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she could sense far more than she let on. For the rest of the evening, they talked about the practicalities of living together schedules, routines, and the peculiarities of each other's customs. Ethan learned that Elorians had a deep connection to their surroundings, often spending hours in meditation to align themselves with the emotional energy around them. In contrast, Ethan found himself feeling more self-conscious, unsure of how much of his own inner thoughts and feelings were being laid bare before her. As the conversation wore on, Ethan found himself growing more comfortable with Lyra's presence, though there was always a part of him that held back. It was hard to open up fully when he knew she might be able to sense every flicker of doubt or hesitation. Eventually, the sky outside darkened to a deep indigo, and Lyra rose from her seat. "It's late. You should rest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Tomorrow will bring new experiences." Ethan nodded, standing up and stretching. "Thanks, Lyra. I appreciate it." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "We'll talk more in the morning. I'm sure there's much we both have to learn." As Ethan retreated to his room, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. There was something about Lyra, something that stirred emotions in him he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably stunning. It was the way she seemed to perceive things beyond the surface, to see him in a way no one else ever had. Lying in bed, staring up at the soft, glowing ceiling, Ethan wondered just what the future held for him here on Eloria. Something told him that this journey was only just beginning, and that Lyra would play a far bigger part in it than he ever could have anticipated. The next morning, Eloria greeted Ethan with its usual serene beauty. The warm light of the twin suns streamed through the large window, casting shimmering patterns on the smooth, curved walls of his new room. For a moment Ethan lay still in bed, taking it all in. The air was fragrant with the scent of the strange, otherworldly flowers that dotted the landscape outside, their subtle aroma a constant reminder of just how far from Earth he truly was. He hadn't seen Lyra yet that morning. Their conversation the night before had left him intrigued. She was so unlike anyone he had ever met, so calm, so attuned to the emotional undercurrents of everything around her. There was something about her presence that made him feel both seen and unsettled, as if she could strip away all the layers of his carefully controlled persona and see right through to the core of him. Shaking off the lingering haze of sleep, Ethan sat up and stretched. He decided a shower might help clear his mind. The water in the Elorian facilities was oddly refreshing, cooler than what he was used to, but invigorating in its own way. As he stood under the gentle spray, Ethan let his thoughts drift, the events of the last few days swirling in his head. He hadn't expected to feel so out of place so quickly. The people of Eloria, with their blue skin and serene expressions, felt like something out of a dream. Everything they did was graceful, fluid, and deliberate, like they were in constant communion with the world around them. Ethan, on the other hand, was all too aware of his clumsy, human movements, his emotions always so close to the surface. After his shower, he toweled off quickly and, feeling more relaxed than he had in days, slipped into his room. His muscles still hummed with the afterglow of the cold water, and his mind wandered to the work he had ahead. He had intended to get dressed immediately, but the warmth of the sunlight filtering into the room made him pause. Instead, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his towel draped loosely around his waist, lost in thought. Then it happened. The door to his room slid open with a faint hiss, and before Ethan could react, Lyra stepped into the doorway. Her large, dark eyes widened in an instant as they landed on him on his bare skin, still glistening with droplets of water from the shower and the towel that barely covered him. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Lyra stood motionless, her hand still on the door, her expression a mix of surprise and something else Ethan couldn't quite place. Shock? Embarrassment? He couldn't tell, but her wide eyes stayed locked on him, and he saw a faint ripple in the air around her, as if her emotions were radiating out in invisible waves. Ethan scrambled to cover himself, instinctively pulling the towel tighter around his waist. Lyra. Sorry, I didn't think. But Lyra didn't move. Her gaze lingered on him, and her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, from shock to something more complex. Her blue skin, normally serene and cool, seemed to glow faintly in the soft light of the room, and Ethan couldn't help but notice the way her body seemed to tense, like she was holding herself in place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. In Aelorian culture, nudity was a sacred thing, something reserved for the most intimate, private moments. It wasn't just about physical exposure, it symbolized emotional vulnerability, a complete opening of oneself to another. And now here was Ethan, exposed before Lyra in a way he had never intended, in a way that was far more significant than just being seen naked. Finally, Lyra took a step back, her hand still gripping the edge of the door. Her voice, when it came, was soft and breathless, barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I wasn't expecting. She trailed off, her dark eyes flickering between confusion and something deeper, something that made Ethan's heart pound in his chest. "It's okay," Ethan said quickly, his own voice thick with the awkwardness of the situation. He stood up, still clutching the towel around him. "I should have locked the door. My fault, really." But Lyra's eyes remained fixed on him, and for the first time Ethan could feel the intensity of her emotions, almost as if they were washing over him. He had known that the Aelorians could perceive emotions, but he had never been on the receiving end of it like this. The air between them felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to address. Lyra blinked, and the spell seemed to break. She stepped back fully into the hallway, her expression now carefully neutral, though Ethan could still see the faintest trace of color in her cheeks, if Aelorians could even blush. "I'll give you some privacy," she murmured, her voice still soft, almost fragile, and then, without another word, she turned and disappeared down the hallway. The door slid shut behind her, leaving Ethan standing there, alone, still clutching his towel. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the door, his heart racing. What had just happened? It was more than just the awkwardness of being seen in an embarrassing moment. There had been something in Lyra's reaction, something more than just surprise. Her shock had been too visceral, too charged with emotion, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder what it meant in Aelorian terms. He finished dressing quickly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. As he slipped on his shirt, his mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. Aelorians were private people, reserved, serene, always in control of their emotions. For Lyra to react the way she did it mean she was beginning to feel something for him? And if so, what was he supposed to do about it? By the time he stepped out of his room, Lyra was nowhere to be seen. The rest of the house was quiet, the warm glow of the Aelorian sun casting long shadows on the floor. He wandered into the common area, hoping to find her, but the silence was almost oppressive. And then, just as he was about to call out her name, he heard a soft hum, barely audible, coming from the small meditation garden outside. Ethan followed the sound, stepping through the open doorway into the lush, green space beyond. There, seated on a smooth stone by the edge of the garden's pool, was Lyra. Her back was to him, her silver hair cascading down her back, the soft glow of the Aelorian sun highlighting her delicate features. She was humming a low, melodic tune that seemed to resonate with the very air around her. Ethan hesitated for a moment, not wanting to interrupt her, but Lyra must have sensed his presence, because she stopped humming and turned to face him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the awkwardness of the earlier encounter hung between them, heavy and unspoken. But there was something else in her gaze now, something deeper and understanding, perhaps, or maybe even a hint of vulnerability. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice as soft as the breeze that rustled the trees around them. I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," Ethan replied, though the words felt inadequate. It was just unexpected. Lyra nodded, her dark eyes searching his face for something, though Ethan wasn't sure what. "In my culture," she began slowly, "what happened earlier. It's not something we take lightly. Nudity is a symbol of openness, of trust. It's something we reserve for those we are deeply connected to." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. I knew your culture was different, but I didn't think." "It's okay," Lyra interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "I know you didn't mean anything by it, but I felt something. I'm not sure what it was, but it was." Intense, her gaze dropped, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her features. "I've never felt anything like that before." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. What had he gotten himself into? This wasn't just about cultural misunderstandings, there was something deeper happening here. Something that neither of them fully understood. And as Ethan looked at Lyra, at the way her emotions seemed to shimmer in the air around her, he realized that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. "I don't know what this means," Ethan said quietly, stepping closer to her, but I want to figure it out. Together. Lyra looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with a mix of emotions: curiosity, confusion, and something else Ethan couldn't quite name. But she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Yes, she said softly. Together. The days that followed were a delicate dance, an unspoken tension that wove itself between Ethan and Lyra. Every glance, every shared moment felt charged with something new, something neither of them could fully articulate. Ethan found himself acutely aware of Lyra's presence in ways that he hadn't been before, how her movements seemed almost fluid, how her voice carried a melody that lingered in the air long after she spoke, and how her eyes, those deep, dark pools, seemed to watch him with a kind of quiet intensity. For her part, Lyra was equally affected. She could feel the shifts in Ethan's emotions, subtle ripples in the emotional energy that surrounded him. She had always sensed the emotions of others, but with Ethan, it was different. His emotions were raw, vibrant, and unguarded in a way that Elorians rarely experienced. And the more time she spent with him, the more she found herself drawn to those emotions: curiosity, longing, confusion, and something deeper that made her heart race in ways she didn't fully understand.
It was during one quiet evening, a few days after their awkward encounter, that everything began to change.
The soft glow of Eloria's twin moons bathed the landscape in a silvery light, casting long shadows across the lush garden outside their home. Inside, the air was thick with the warmth of the day, and Ethan found himself lounging on the sofa, absent-mindedly flipping through a datapad filled with cultural texts. Lyra sat across from him, her legs tucked beneath her on a low cushion, silently observing him as he read. The silence between them had become comfortable in its own way, but tonight it felt different, heavier, as if there was something waiting to be said. Ethan could feel Lyra's eyes on him, and every time he glanced up, she quickly averted her gaze, as though she was trying to hide something. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer, Ethan set the datapad aside and looked directly at her. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Is something on your mind?"
Lyra hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of the cushion she was sitting on. For a long moment, she said nothing, but then she met his gaze, and Ethan could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Ethan," she began, her voice low and hesitant, "I've been thinking about what happened the other day, about how I reacted." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had been replaying that moment over and over in his mind, wondering what it had meant for her. "You don't have to explain," he said quickly, wanting to ease her discomfort. "I get that it was a cultural thing. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable."
But Lyra shook her head, her expression serious. "It's not just that. Yes, in Elorian culture, nudity is something sacred, but it's more than that. What I felt when I saw you, it wasn't just shock, it was something else." She paused, searching for the right words. "Something I've never felt before." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He leaned forward slightly, the space between them suddenly feeling too vast. "What do you mean?" Lyra looked down at her hands, her long fingers tracing invisible patterns on the cushion. "I could feel your emotions, Ethan. I could feel your embarrassment, your awkwardness. But there was something else, something deeper, something you weren't even aware of. It was like a spark, a connection that lit up the air between us. And ever since then..." She trailed off, her cheeks tinged with a faint, bluish blush. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Lyra," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I felt it too." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, wide and searching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, emotions hanging in the space like the scent of the strange flowers that bloomed outside. "I don't understand it," Ethan continued, his voice growing more urgent. "I've never felt this way before, not like this. It's like there's something pulling me toward you, and I don't know how to stop it." Lyra's breath hitched slightly, her chest rising and falling with a sudden intensity. She could feel the emotions radiating from Ethan: desire, confusion, fear. They swirled around him, raw and unfiltered, and it was intoxicating in a way she had never experienced. Elorians were always so controlled, so careful with their emotions. But Ethan was different. His emotions were like a storm, wild and unpredictable, and Lyra found herself drawn to that storm in ways she hadn't anticipated. Slowly, almost tentatively, she stood and crossed the room, her bare feet making no sound on the smooth floor. Ethan watched her approach, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step she took seemed to resonate in the air between them, heightening the tension that had been building for days. When she reached him, Lyra hesitated for just a moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then, with a deep breath, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shockwave through Ethan, as if her touch had ignited something deep within him.
"I can feel it too," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Whatever this is between us, it's more than just curiosity. It's something real."
Ethan couldn't speak. He could only nod, his throat tight with the emotions swirling inside him. He had never felt this kind of intensity before, this kind of connection with anyone. And as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he realized that it wasn't just about physical attraction, it was something deeper, something he couldn't fully explain but knew was there. Without thinking, he reached up and placed his hand over hers, their fingers intertwining. The moment their hands touched, Lyra gasped softly, her emotions flaring in a way that Ethan could almost feel in the air around them. Her control, the careful calm she always maintained, seemed to slip for just a moment, and he could see the desire in her eyes, the vulnerability that she had tried to hide. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice barely audible. It was all the invitation he needed. In one fluid motion, Ethan rose from the sofa, pulling her gently toward him. Their bodies were so close now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, could see the way her breath quickened as she looked up at him. For a moment they stood there, suspended in the tension between them, neither daring to move, as if the slightest shift would shatter the fragile balance they had found. Then, slowly, tentatively, Ethan leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the boundaries of this new connection. But then something shifted, something broke open between them, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more intense. Lyra's hand slid up to his shoulders, her fingers tightening against his skin as she leaned into him, her body pressing against his, in a way that felt both natural and exhilarating. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of sensations, the softness of her lips, the way her body seemed to fit perfectly against his, the faint hum of her emotions buzzing in the air around them. Every touch, every movement sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he could feel the intensity of her desire matching his own. But even as the kiss grew more heated, more passionate, there was something else there, something deeper, something that went beyond the physical. It was as if their emotions were intertwining, becoming one, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt completely open, completely vulnerable. Ethan and Lyra's emotional connection had grown, drawing them closer in ways neither had anticipated. As their hands met, the intensity of the emotions they shared flowed between them, making them both realize just how deep their bond had become. In this moment, they understood that what was unfolding between them was something special, something beyond mere curiosity. Lyra looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing trust and acceptance reflected back at her. The space between them disappeared, but it wasn't just a physical closeness, it was an emotional one. In a Lorien culture, such closeness was reserved for those with a profound emotional connection, and Lyra knew she had found that with Ethan. Ethan approached her gently, his touch filled with care and respect. They didn't need words to communicate what they felt. The emotional energy between them was almost tangible, a silent agreement that what they were sharing went beyond mere attraction. In that quiet moment, they embraced, feeling the weight of their connection as it wrapped around them like a warm, comforting blanket. This intimacy was more than just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. They were united in a way that transcended the surface, deepening their bond in ways they hadn't fully understood before. As the night wore on, Ethan and Lyra remained close, realizing that they had not only strengthened their trust in each other, but also discovered the precious depth of the connection that now bound them together. The days following their shared moment were like stepping into uncharted territory. Ethan and Lyra, once tentative and careful around each other, now moved with a different energy, one filled with a quiet understanding. The air between them no longer carried the weight of unspoken tension, but instead, a deep connection that they both felt, though they rarely put it into words. Ethan found himself thinking about Lyra constantly, the way she moved with an effortless grace, the way her voice seemed to carry the melody of the world around her, and most of all, the way her emotions flowed through the air between them, touching him in ways he'd never thought possible. The bond they had formed wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual even, and Ethan was slowly coming to realize that what he felt for her was far more profound than he had initially understood. Yet, with this growing bond came a sense of conflict that Ethan couldn't ignore. His time on Eloria was temporary. The exchange program was never meant to be permanent. There was a part of him that knew he would eventually have to make a choice: stay here, in this alien world that was slowly becoming home, or return to Earth, where the familiarity of his old life waited for him. But that old life now felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Ethan was deep in thought one afternoon, sitting outside in the soft light of the twin suns, when Lyra approached him. She moved silently, as she always did, her steps so light that he didn't hear her until she was standing beside him. He looked up, and their eyes met. There was something different in her gaze today, something that made his heart skip a beat. "Ethan," she said softly, sitting down next to him on the stone bench, "there's something we need to talk about." The seriousness in her tone immediately grabbed his attention. He sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench, her eyes cast downward for a moment before she met his gaze again. "I can feel your conflict," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I can feel how torn you are between this world and your own. And I think it's time we face what that means." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. He looked away, staring at the distant horizon, where the shimmering forests of Eloria met the sky. "I don't know what to do," he admitted after a long pause. "This place, it's become more than just a temporary assignment for me. And you," he stopped, struggling to find the right words. "You've become more important to me than I ever expected." Lyra's expression softened, and she reached out to take his hand, her touch warm and familiar. "I feel the same," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we both know your time here was never meant to be permanent. And I can't ask you to stay, not when you have a whole life waiting for you back on Earth." Ethan's chest tightened at the thought of leaving her. The idea of returning to Earth, of resuming his life there without her, felt like an impossibility. He had come to Eloria to learn, to explore, but he had never expected to find something or someone who would change him so deeply. Lyra had become more than just a companion. She had become a part of him, and the thought of losing her now was unbearable. "I don't want to leave," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't want to go back to Earth without you." Lyra's grip on his hand tightened, and for a moment she closed her eyes as if struggling to keep her emotions in check. When she opened them again, there was a sadness there that Ethan hadn't seen before. "Ethan, I want you to stay," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want you to feel like you have to. I've seen your memories, your feelings for your home. I've felt your longing for Earth, even if you don't always acknowledge it. And I know what it's like to miss the place you come from." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. He had never fully realized just how much Lyra could feel, how deeply she could understand his emotions, even the ones he hadn't put into words. But there was something else too, something unspoken in the way she was looking at him now, as if she was preparing herself for a difficult truth. "I've never told you this," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "but Elorians, we don't just feel emotions, we're bound by them. Our connections, once made, are nearly impossible to break. And the connection I've formed with you, it's stronger than anything I've ever felt before." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What are you saying?" Lyra looked down at their intertwined hands, her thumb brushing lightly over his skin. "I'm saying that if you stay, if we choose to be together, it won't just be for a short time, it will be forever. That's the way my people are. We don't love lightly, and I can't ask you to make that choice unless you're sure it's what you want." Ethan was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. Forever. The word echoed in his mind, and with it came the realization that this wasn't just a decision about staying on Eloria or returning to Earth. It was a decision about his future, about who he wanted to be, and who he wanted to be with. He looked into Lyra's eyes, and for the first time he truly understood what she was offering him. A life together, a bond that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. But it was also a life that would require him to leave behind everything he had known, to step fully into this new world and never look back. "I don't know if I'm ready for forever," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But I know I don't want to lose you. I don't want to go back to Earth and spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Lyra's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "I don't want to lose you either," she whispered, "but I also don't want you to regret your choice." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but as he looked at Lyra, at the way her emotions seemed to wrap around him like a protective embrace, he realized something important. He had already made his choice, even if he hadn't fully acknowledged it yet. "I want to stay," he said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised even him. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever it is, I want it to be with you." Lyra's breath hitched, and for a moment she just stared at him, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, a smile filled with relief, with joy, and with a love that Ethan could feel radiating through the air between them. Without another word, she pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as if she were afraid he might disappear. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, feeling the warmth of her body against his, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, and for the first time since arriving on Eloria, he felt at peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sacrifices they would have to make, he knew they would face them together. And in that moment, under the soft light of the twin suns, Ethan and Lyra made an unspoken promise to each other. A promise of love, of trust, and of a future they would build side by side. And as they stood there, holding each other, Ethan realized that he had found something far more important than he had ever expected on this distant planet. He had found a home. The decision to stay had lifted a weight off Ethan's shoulders, but it wasn't without its consequences. The night after he and Lyra had made their commitment to one another, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The enormity of what he had chosen began to sink in. He had given up everything he had known his life on Earth, the familiarity of his own people, even his career for a future that, while promising, was filled with uncertainty. Yet every time his thoughts spiraled into doubt, the memory of Lyra's touch and the certainty in her eyes pulled him back. In the soft glow of the Elorian moons, Ethan shifted in bed and looked at her sleeping form beside him. Her silver hair spilled over the pillow, and her peaceful expression radiated a calm that Ethan envied. In moments like this, the vastness of the galaxy felt small, and all that mattered was the connection they had forged, fragile but resilient, tested but unbroken. The next morning, as the twin suns rose over the horizon, bathing the landscape in warm, golden light, Ethan and Lyra faced the reality of their new life together. Ethan's presence on Eloria as part of the exchange program had been formal and structured, with duties to fulfill and a clear end date, but now that he had decided to stay, things were different. The leaders of the exchange program would need to be notified, and more importantly, Ethan would need to find a place for himself within Elorian society. It wasn't as simple as just staying. He had to integrate into a world that wasn't his own. Over breakfast, they discussed what this meant for him. Lyra, ever patient, explained the intricacies of Elorian life, the different factions and roles within their society. There were opportunities for him. He could work with their environmentalists, learning more about the planet's ecosystems, or even with the cultural liaisons, helping to bridge the gap between Elorians and other off-world species. But whatever path he chose, it would require him to fully immerse himself in their way of life, to become, in essence, more Elorian than human. "I don't expect you to change who you are," Lyra said as she poured a cup of the fragrant tea unique to Eloria, its aroma filling the air. "But I do want you to understand that our way of life is different, our connections to each other, to the planet, to the emotional energy around us. It's everything. You'll need to embrace that if you're truly going to stay." Ethan nodded, though the weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. He had been prepared for a change, but not for the depth of what staying truly entailed. Still, as he looked across the table at Lyra, the woman who had become the center of his world, he knew that he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The first step in solidifying his place on Eloria was meeting with the leaders of the exchange program. They needed to formally acknowledge his decision to remain and renegotiate the terms of his stay. Ethan was nervous about this meeting. It felt like he was stepping into a new role, one that was not fully defined. But Lyra reassured him, her hand resting on his arm, her calming energy flowing into him. "They'll understand," she said. "And if they don't, we'll find a way to make them understand. You belong here now with me." That afternoon they made their way to the grand meeting hall in Valoren, the capital city. The building itself was an impressive blend of natural and architectural beauty, with its curved walls built seamlessly into the towering trees that surrounded it. Inside, the air was cool, and the gentle hum of Aelorian emotional energy was palpable, a constant reminder of how different this world was from Earth. As they approached the council, Ethan felt the weight of their gazes upon him. The Aelorian leaders were tall, graceful, and impossibly serene, their expressions unreadable. But Lyra stood by his side, her presence a silent reassurance. The conversation began formally, with the council acknowledging Ethan's original purpose on Aeloria as part of the exchange. They were curious but cautious about his decision to stay. Ethan explained his reasons as best he could, how his connection with Lyra had changed him, how he had come to see Aeloria as more than just a temporary home. He spoke from the heart, letting his emotions guide his words, just as Lyra had taught him. For a moment there was silence. Then, one of the council members, a woman with deep blue skin and silver markings that glistened under the soft lights, spoke. "Your decision is not one we take lightly," she said, her voice melodic yet firm. "To remain here is to become part of us, to embrace our ways, our traditions. You must understand that you will no longer be just an observer of our culture, you will be expected to live it." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I'm ready for that." The council member studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Finally, she smiled a small, approving smile. "Very well," she said. "We will grant your request to stay, on one condition." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What condition? "You must undergo the ritual of binding." Ethan glanced at Lyra, confusion flickering in his eyes. She hadn't mentioned this before. Lyra stepped forward, her expression serious but calm. "The ritual of binding is a sacred Aelorian tradition," she explained. "It's a ceremony that bonds two people together, emotionally and spiritually. It's more than just a commitment, it's a merging of two energies, two lives. If you truly wish to stay, you must undergo this ritual with me. It will bind us forever." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Forever. That word again. He hadn't expected this, but as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he saw the depth of her love for him, the quiet strength she carried, and he knew that there was no turning back now. "I'll do it," he said without hesitation. "I want to do it." The council members exchanged glances, then nodded in approval. "The ritual will take place tomorrow," the lead council member said. "Prepare yourselves." That night, Ethan and Lyra stood on the balcony of their home, the twin moons casting a soft glow over the landscape. The weight of what was to come hung between them, but it wasn't a burden, it was a promise. "Are you sure about this?" Lyra asked, her voice soft as she leaned against him, her hand resting on his chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he whispered. "I'm ready." Lyra smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood in silence, the gentle hum of the planet's emotional energy surrounding them like a protective shield. The next day, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Ethan and Lyra stood in the sacred grove, surrounded by the towering trees and the quiet stillness of the forest. The council members were there, watching silently as the ritual began. Lyra stood across from Ethan, her silver hair shimmering in the morning light, her dark eyes locked on his. As the ritual commenced, they joined hands, and a soft, glowing light began to emanate from their clasped fingers. Ethan could feel the energy, warm and comforting, flowing between them, intertwining their emotions, their thoughts, their very souls. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before, a merging of two lives into one. And as the light enveloped them, Ethan felt the final threads of doubt slip away. This was his home now. Aeloria, Lyra. This new life they were building together. When the ritual was complete, the council members bowed their heads in respect, acknowledging the bond that had been formed. Ethan and Lyra stood together, hand in hand, their futures bound to one another. It wasn't just a new beginning for Ethan, it was a new chapter for both of them, a chapter filled with love, trust, and the promise of a life built on the connection they had forged. And as they walked away from the sacred grove, the warmth of the suns on their backs, Ethan knew that he had found something far greater than he had ever imagined. Not just a new home, but a new purpose, a new life. Together.